This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, early April 2012, let's go to Wisconsin, where a ton of attention and money and TV ads and much more is descending on the state, where there is an increasingly contentious effort underway to recall Republican Governor Scott Walker. Walker had won election just a couple years before in 2010, riding that national wave of Tea Party politics. Now he was in office and he's clashing with unions. He'd introduced austerity budgeting measures and otherwise started to remake a state that has a deep urban-rural blue-red divide. You'll maybe remember those 2011 protests that descended on the Capitol from people trying to stop Scott Walker's budget measures. That is all wrapped up into this. And now there is this attempt to stop him at the ballot box, again, through a recall election. Supporters of the recall said that this was the best way to prevent him from enacting draconian policies. Others saw this as an attempt to redo or undo an election that Walker had won fair and square just a couple years earlier. So we will get into all of that. Let's cast our minds back to not that long ago. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Let's set that context. I hinted at it in the intro here, but I think the two big moments that I stick out for me are obviously his election in 2010 as part of that Tea Party wave, and then those protests a year later. I think those images really flew around. But I don't know. You want to lay the context of who Scott Walker was and how he fit into the 2010 Tea Party wave moment?
Scott Walker was very much a Tea Party candidate in the sense that he was coming into office in kind of like a Paul Ryan kind of mode, like a wonkish, but like, let's definitely start cutting some things. Wisconsin, blue-purple kind of state. But at the governor's level, it's one of those states that will occasionally put into place what we think of as like those moderate Republican governors. And so I think some people also thought Walker might fit into that mold. But when he got into office, as you were saying, Jody, he took advantage of the aftermath of the financial crisis to start making deep, deep cuts in ways that had been Republican priorities since the Reagan administration, right? Let's curb the power of public unions. Let's curb the power of state universities. Let's basically cut to the bone all of these social programs, but also public services. And that is what leads to these massive protests. 100,000 people are showing up at the state capitol to protest these budget cuts in what was, I think, part of the wave that would also be Occupy Wall Street and then kind of like the economic populism of the Democratic Party in the 2012 election. Like, that's all in the stew here.
And it's funny because my sister lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and big college town for UW and all of that. And when you think about Wisconsin, Niki, you're right. It is a blue state. It has these big, deep blue cities like Milwaukee and Madison, but then it also has those outlining sort of like red, rural, more conservative pockets as well. But when you think about Madison and it's sort of being the capital of Wisconsin and right in the hub of sort of this college town that's facing, the flagship school is right. UW, and they're getting these massive cuts. People are not at all happy with that. And the backlash is swift and fierce.
You don't have to commute too far to attend the protest, right?
That's right. No, you don't. No, you don't. You just walk across the street.
And obviously, this is a long brewing dynamic, but I think in the last 10 years we've seen, in a state like Wisconsin, this red-blue divide, urban-rural, a lot of it exacerbated by gerrymandering. And it's interesting how the sort of redistricting has become the sort of dominant conversation in a state like Wisconsin. Back not that long ago, 14 years ago, 12 years ago, this fight wasn't specifically about redistricting. It was mostly about budgeting, but obviously the redistricting and the kind of disconnect at the pockets of power is a huge underlying element to to all of this.
Right, because the state legislature is also playing a role, as we'll talk about, and that state legislature tilts more Republican than the state at large because of, I mean, this is the way that gerrymandering works and this is the way that districting works, is that in many, many places across the U.S., it favors rural counties, which means there's more rural representation, which means there's more Republican representation than there are Republicans in the state.
So there's a sense of a disconnect there, right, between kind of the state at large and the representatives it has. I also think in the wake of the Tea Party moment, and this happens a lot in politics, it happens for both Democrats and Republicans, but, I think in the wake of the Tea Party moment, this is so instructive as showing like the Tea Party was a movement built a lot on anger and resentment and, frustration. And then the politicians who rode that wave came in with like policies. And some of those policies didn't necessarily maybe connect directly with what was at the source of some of the anger, And I mean, that happens a lot, right? Politicians often take advantage of emotional moments to then sort of enact their agenda. But I think we're seeing it, now that like people support Donald Trump for one reason, and then they turn around and they look at the policies he actually implemented as president, and it's like, well, I don't know if tax cuts for the rich was exactly what I was angry about, or, what was the solution to my anger. And so I think there's a little bit of that here in that Scott Walker gets into office and he's like, well, I have this mandate. I just rode this wave of anger and I'm going to do all the things that I'm going to do as a traditional Republican. I'm going to try and undermine unions. I'm going to try and pass a new budget. I'm going to scale way back. And part of that is, wrapped up in the Tea Party stuff. I think part of that is also like, wait a minute, this isn't exactly what this moment's about.
I think people have a lot of ideas about what they want to implement. And then when they actually get in the job and they actually see the budget that's available to them or what needs to be cut, they have to pivot in ways that make more sense or that promote something that's sustainable. And that's always not going to make a lot of people happy.
It's also a representation of the two starkly different policy choices, economic policy choices that folks faced in the aftermath of the 2008 collapse. It's, are you going to invest and try to stimulate the economy that way? Or are you going to choose austerity measures? And places that chose austerity measures took a lot longer to recover. But I mean, it's not just happening at the national level, it's happening at the state level as well.
Yeah. So at the state level in Wisconsin, there's immediately pushback to his new budgets. He's going up against the public unions. The protests come in. Democratic state senators themselves also. This is the moment where we should do a special week where we rerun all of our episodes about state representatives fleeing the state in order to not have to vote.
Yes.
But there's a moment here where Democrats flee the state because they want to prevent a vote on one of these big union fights that Walker has started. And then, the protests descend, hundreds of thousands. I think a lot of people, that was the moment it really popped onto their consciousness, just seeing those masses and those flags and the chanting happening inside the state capitol itself. But let's go to the recall itself. So I gather that there's a law on the books that you can't, mount a recall effort for a couple years. So they kind of have to wait until 2012 to really get it going. But what is the thinking behind the recall and how does it actually start to get implemented?
Well, it's that mass mobilization that you see in 2011 that makes Democrats and organizers think they have a chance to recall Scott Walker, right? He's come into office. His policies have been deeply polarizing. They seem to be very unpopular. Getting enough ballot signatures in order to get this recall put on the ballot is pretty easy when you have hundreds of thousands of people in one place rallying against Scott Walker.
Sign here,
right?
Sign here.
And it's like you have this tool as a state that allows you to recall elected officials. And so they're like, let's give it a try.
Yeah. It's interesting, too, because, when you think about recalls, there haven't been a whole lot of governor recalls. You've had I remember Gray Davis in California. Yes. That was 2003. And then Lynn Frazier in North Dakota. No one remembers this. 1921. I mean, that's...
We're going to have to cover that
wild,
one.
But I know. I was like, is it because she's a woman? Is Lynn a woman, though?
I doubt it.
Doubt it.
I doubt the North Dakota governor in 1921 was a woman.
I know. I was like, wait a second, Kellie. But it does take an incredible amount of signatures. I mean, trying to get like basically 1 million signatures is no easy feat. So which is why you don't see it happen all the time. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible, and it certainly was in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
There was real division about this question, though, because even within the Democratic Party, which was pretty solidly united against Scott Walker, it wasn't clear. You know, some people wanted to move ahead with a recall and just remove him now at this point in time. Others were like, look, he was elected. Let's let him wreak his havoc for a few more years until we have the next set of elections, kind of a you break it, you bought it kind of approach to office holding in elections. And so that tension within the party is also going to play out in the broader recall campaign, because there are people who opposed Walker who didn't necessarily think this was the right way to get him out.
Yeah, because also recalls are expensive. I mean, it takes a massive amount of mobilization and finances in order to pull someone out of office. And I mean, studies show that it took about $80 million. They spent $80 million to remove him from office. It only took like $37 million for him to run the race. So when you think about also like, where could this money have gone? That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's not an easy thing to do. And it's not a cheap thing.
A lot of it is outside money, you know, and so I think it shows kind of a moment. And we're certainly living in that moment where these kind of local pivotal races become nationalized, and then just people, you know, sometimes it's just cope. People feel like, oh, I can send money and just feel like I'm contributing, and it becomes this cause. And that's certainly what this moment was.
Yeah, it's a really specific historical moment, in part because you're a year or two removed from Citizens United. It's also, I mean, the 2008 presidential campaign was when people really started to get used to, I'm going to give $5 to this campaign, and got used to making political donations online. And that kind of habit was instilled by the time 2011 rolls around. And for folks who don't yet have attention focused on like the 2012 presidential race, they can look at Wisconsin and be like, okay, this is where I'm going to put my energies and my donations to get Scott Walker recalled.
Hey, our Radiotopia colleagues, the Kitchen Sisters, have a new episode I think you'll want to check out. It's called Buildings Speak, Stories of Pioneering Women Architects, hosted by Frances McDormand. Trailblazers, groundbreakers, skyscraper visionaries, little-known stories of Julia Morgan, Natalie DeBlois, Amazalie Meredith, women who changed the skyline and the built environment that surrounds us today. Listen to the Kitchen Sisters present everywhere you find podcasts, and at kitchensisters.org.
I want to come back to this division within the Democratic Party and then this larger question of kind of the impetus behind the recall and whether the recall was the right sort of course of action in order to push back against Walker's policies. I mean, I certainly think there were a lot of people who were arguing that you win elections at the ballot box and the elections happen every 4 years, and that this is an attempt to undo or redo an election that Walker won fair and square just 2 years earlier. One thing that added to that kind of redo narrative, which I think is very reasonable, was that the Democrats renominated the same person, Milwaukee Mayor Tom Barrett, who had, you know, and so it really was just like a rerun 2 years later. And so, you know, look, we're living in a moment now where mostly Republicans, and mostly for BS reasons, are casting doubt on the validity of elections. But, you know, this has also happened. Democrats in the past have also sort of called into question the results of an election and sort of said, well, we should be fighting back against what just happened in this previous election. And sometimes there are specific accusations of, you know, malfeasance. And in other cases, you know, it just feels like sour grapes, if I'm being perfectly honest. And I don't know.
Most of it feels like sour grapes. I could see if the person who was in office was extremely corrupt and you had evidence to point to that corruption, and you could say there was this, and it's all legitimate and crystal clear, that makes sense to me. But I think it makes the state feel like it's in a constant state of election or state of campaigning when you can't seem to get consensus around who should be in office, or maybe not even consensus, like resignation around someone being in office.
I will say, I don't totally hate the recall idea. I also don't know that it's completely analogous to calling elections into question, only because in this instance, it wasn't that Walker was illegitimately elected. It was, we have this tool. Like, it was meeting what they saw as a problem of a democratic outcome with more democracy, right? That we're going to do the signatures, we're going to hold the election, and they lose, which is also a democratic outcome.
And the recall's on the recall is on the books for a reason, right? It's a tool. It's there for you to use. It's not like they went outside the law to pull this move. Sure. Correct.
And I think it's interesting that the exit polls showed that people agreed with just what you were saying, Jody, and Kellie, it should, malfeasance, yes. Unpopularity, no. But, bad policy decisions you disagree with, that's not what we use recalls for. And I think that was a message that was carried across in the election itself. So it probably was an enormous waste of money. And I don't know that it necessarily helped move the ball forward. But, it gave people a place to put their organizational energies within the rules.
And I also do, yes. And I should be clear that it is within the rules. And I do think, it is also a moment that is reflective of maybe the sort of beginning of an era in which this is critical stuff. And I think you use every tool at your disposal. And I think it's very reasonable for people to feel that way, that we have to do everything we can to protect, what's at stake in this moment. And so mostly I look at, fights, and a lot of them are taking place in Wisconsin now too. I look at fights over, really hard-nosed power politics fights. And I say, well, I think that those kinds of tactics tend to match what's at stake in our country right now. And so I do see a lot of that in this as well. And I think the fact that this was born of public protest, I think indicates that there was a legitimate sort of will at the heart of this. That said, this narrative, I'm totally sympathetic to this narrative that emerged of, well, this feels like sour grapes. This feels like it's, we're touching the hot stove. And I think, to your point, Walker ends up winning by a bigger margin than he did in 2010. It does get people involved, and that's sort of part of what we're seeing now too. It's like when politics is terrible and awful and apocalyptic, people do tend to get involved. I guess that's a slightly silver lining.
You get your P for participation.
A lot of people came out and voted. 2.5 million versus 2.15 million, which is kind of crazy for just a one-off sort of mid-cycle election. But then again, exit polls showed that voters thought, maybe this is a little inappropriate for this moment. Maybe we shouldn't have done the recall.
And in many ways, it shores up Walker's power, right?
Yeah, exactly.
He could say, I now have a mandate for the things that I have already done, and so I'm going to do one more.
Yeah, the I have a mandate kills me, but
No, but it's so reflective of the political calculus, for instance, with Donald Trump, of you go after him a bunch of times for stuff that I think is perfectly legitimate, but if he escapes, he then gets politically, rhetorically to talk about how, they came after me and I survived. Not to compare necessarily Scott Walker to Donald Trump in that way. But, again, I just see this story as sort of an early indicator, so much of the sort of political dynamics of what we're living with right now. It also, of course, April 2012 is the very early run-up to the 2012 presidential election. It has a little bit of an effect there. I think at some basic level, it just kind of people were able to get their political angst out by paying attention to this election before the presidential election had fully heated up. But it doesn't do, I don't think, Obama any big favors going into a crucial swing state that fall. What do you think?
I don't know that helps
Obama wins.
Right, but I don't know that the recall itself helps him, but his message in the 2012 campaign, especially once he finds out he's running against venture capitalist Mitt Romney is one of, again, like progressive economic populism against austerity politics, against the wealthy. And the activism that had been happening in Wisconsin prior to the recall really fit into that message. And you could kind of see an unbroken stream that runs from the Wisconsin protest through Occupy Wall Street, through the Obama 2012 election, that I think is fascinating to think about, given where our politics are right now. And Wisconsin is an important part of the story of what would become the 2012 election.
Yeah. And of course, there's also this interesting dynamic of the disconnect sometimes between how a state votes for a president versus how a state votes for local officials. And, Walker keeps winning. He wins the recall. Obviously, he wins in 2014, his third election in 4 years. He wins. Then he loses in 2018 to Tony Evers by like a percentage point. And Evers continues to be the governor now. And it's like, that was the first moment where Democrats started to claw back a little bit of the power. Let's leave it there with the 2012 recall. A lot of folks have emailed us and asked us to touch on it. I hope people listening from Wisconsin feel like we did an okay job. But
we didn't do the accent, though.
We didn't do the accent. No, I think that's probably for the best.
That's probably
But let's do some also on this day's other things that happened April 7th throughout the years.
Sure. On April 7th of 1984, the Census Bureau reported that Los Angeles had overtaken Chicago as the nation's second city in terms of population.
Fortunately, Chicago had taken Second City as its nickname, so it continues on.
I don't know if I'm surprised by that or not. It feels slightly late, maybe, but I know that Chicago...
It feels late to me, too.
Yeah.
And, Houston is gaining on all of that.
Oh, yeah.
So, I don't know what this looks like now.
Yeah.
I like the little hometown pride there.
Yeah, just saying.
And on this day in 1954, Dwight Eisenhower held a news conference in which he spoke of the importance of containing the spread of communism in Indochina, saying, and I quote, "You have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly." He doesn't say it's the domino theory, but that's where we get that.
I think it's pretty reasonable to call that the domino theory.
Yes,
it's
a theory about dominoes.
Metaphor, and yes, exactly. And then in 1959, on this day, April 7th, a referendum in Oklahoma repeals the state's ban on alcoholic beverages, which, again, that feels kind of late as well.
Late.
But I think anyone who has read...
My goodness.
Anyone who's read our pal Sam Anderson's book about Oklahoma, Boomtown, knows that people were getting their fun in well before that. I don't know if that repeal really
just like
with
national prohibition, people don't stop drinking.
Yeah.
All right, well, we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to This Day in Esoteric Political History. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Our transcripts, which you can find on our website, are done by Kala Nakua. This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, creator-owned, listener-supported podcasts. Audrey Martovich is executive producer. Yuri Lasordo is director of operations. If you want to support the show, tell a friend about This Day and become a member of Radiotopia at whatever level works for you. You can do that at our website, thisdaypod.com. Also on our site, you can find transcripts, sign up for our newsletter, find links to follow us on Instagram and Threads, buy merch like shirts and hats and phone cases, find information about our theme song, give feedback on an episode we've done, or suggest topics for a future episode. That and lots more, thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. We'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.